So I want to welcome from the stage of Quay, Mike Williams. Mike, welcome to the show. I'm excited. You can tell.
Rick, thank you so much for the intro. I hope I live up to it.
You're going to do great. I mean, I'm really have been talking about this for a while. As I was just saying, I rant once in a while about the Beatles because I kind of take some flack for it, and I don't get it. I never got it. I tried. It's not an effort of trying, but I just never felt a connection to their music. And it's changing, as I said, slowly. It's getting there. I'm starting to appreciate it, I think, because of the musicianship. But it's still not like what most fanatics are like. And so, but I like music from that genre. I'm very into, all those other bands. I like the Doors and I like the Stones and I like a lot of those older bands. I like Elvis. I mean, I'm all through. I just, the Beatles never stuck with me. So I'm here to learn from you, Mike. I want to know about the Beatles, how they started, what is going on with them. There's a lot of rumors. Is Paul dead? I want to find out what you think. And just wherever you want it to start, right at the beginning. How about the beginning?
Well, the beginning would be I was one of those people that loved the Beatles, Rick. I grew up with them. Back in 1968, I was a little Beatle freak. I was born in 59, so I was 9 years old in 1968. And I was well aware of the Beatles. And I begged my parents to take me to the movie theater to go see Yellow Submarine. And so my father took both myself and my brother. My brother's 15 months younger than I am. So we had these two little Beatle fans going to the movie theater to go see the movie. And I remember being disappointed because I didn't realize it was an animation.
Mm-hmm.
But at the very end, the Beatles come out. It's like a 10-minute little segment at the end of the film. And that made it for me. Now, my father had to sit there for an hour and a half in anguish because Dad did not get the Beatles. So they were very influential in my life, and music has been a big, big part of my life, and the Beatles were integral to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was a Beatle freak. I was in the church. I've said on a number of interviews that I had a front row pew in the Church of the Fab Four. And my brother used to come to my house and say that I had a Beatles shrine. I had all of this Beatle memorabilia, posters. To this day, I still have a vinyl collection of Beatle records that probably rivals just about anybody's collection of Beatle albums. I collected for years and years and years, and I collected their vinyl from all across the world. Recently, I've been selling, well, actually, I should say I sold a big chunk of it off.
Mm-hmm.
I kept the what I deem to be the most collectible, most valuable pieces. But what I've been doing over time, ever since I got into the research on the Beatles, and realizing that there's a completely different narrative than what we've been told.
Absolutely.
Very, very different. And so some of the luster has come off the band. I still love the music. I still like to listen to it. But it doesn't have the same impact that it used to have because of what my research has unfolded.
Mm-hmm. And you've done 8 years of research, if I'm correctly remembering. 8 years is a long time. That music, when I started learning about all of what we're going to be talking about, I will agree, Mike, that music for a while, that's a great term, lackluster, because you start to really question all of music, which I'm going to get into with definitely tonight. But I get it. It's when you find out what's behind it, you're like, it really makes you look at it different.
It does. It makes you take a hard look at the industry,
mm-hmm.
not just the music industry, but entertainment overall.
Right.
And then when you realize that the music and entertainment industry is a huge lever in how the controllers control the world, the pieces start to come together. Now, I will say it's very difficult to get your head wrapped around this. It's a very hard pill to swallow. I was no exception. What happened to me was in 2016, I read a book titled, I'll show it here so people can see it. It's The Memoirs of Billy Shears. Okay, so the book first came out in 2009. I caught up with it in 2016. And the way I found the book, I was on Amazon, and then a recommendation popped up and said, hey, you might like this book. And so I took a look. I read the overview, and I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And so when the book came and I started reading it, I just couldn't believe what I was reading because the story that this book tells is so diametrically opposed to the official narrative that it makes you step back. And so I read the entire book, and I wound up having a discussion with Sophia Smallstorm going back into the earlier part of 2016. And I told her I was reading the book, and it's a very, very interesting read, and I needed time to really let things settle in because, like I said, the narrative is so different.
Right.
And she asked me to come on her show to talk about the book. And at first, I really didn't want to do it. The main reason was because the book is 666 pages, so there's the beginning of some occult numbers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
66 chapters, some more occult numbers. And so my first thought was, well, do I really want to spend the time to boil down a 666-page book for a 90-minute or a 2-hour presentation? So Sophia, being Sophia, she was very determined to get me to talk about it. So finally I relented. In order to do the presentation, to do the show with her, I actually had to create this huge PowerPoint presentation in order to organize the book, to organize the topics so it would flow in a way that it made sense to the audience back when I did the show with her back in September of 2016. Before that, I was aware of the Paul is Dead conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
And for those that don't know, it's a conspiracy that goes back to 1966, actually, but it got legs in 1969. And the conspiracy says that Paul McCartney, the original Paul McCartney, who I refer to as biological Paul, died in a car crash in late 1966. And we will get different dates. Some researchers will say it was August of 66. The book tells us it was September 11th of 1966. And when we get to that part of our conversation, I'll explain why I think September 11th makes more sense to me. And other researchers will say that the date was November 9th, which is the inverse of September 11th. So November 9th is September 11th.
Interesting.
And so the book talks about the Paul is Dead conspiracy. It is written in first person, and the author, who is actually really the encoder, is Thomas E.U. Harriot.
Okay.
And the reason why Tom is referred to as the encoder is because the book is encoded. It is classified as historical fiction, but because the book is layered and encoded, if you're intrepid enough, it's like a big puzzle. Let me just put it that way. So if you're interested in digging and figuring out whether the book is truthful or not, which was what I did, you start to break the code. You start to decode it. And once you do that, you come to the realization that the book is truthful. Are there threads of fiction in the book? Yes. Why is that done? For plausible deniability.
Exactly. Yep.
So it's very clear once you start reading the book, because it is just loaded up with information that, at least what I thought was, the only way that information can make it into the book is it has to come from a source that is very close or was very close to the situation or is the person that's playing the role of Paul McCartney.
Okay.
And so we get introduced to Billy Shears on the Sgt. Pepper album. We have the title track, Sgt. Pepper. Then that makes it segues into With a Little Help from My Friends. And the transition from the first track to the second track, Billy Shears is introduced, the one and only Billy Shears. And a lot of Beatle fans think that because Ringo sang the song, that Ringo is Billy Shears, and it's not. What the Beatles did was they used Ringo to sing the song as really a way to deflect away from the new Paul McCartney.
Okay.
It's very similar to what John Lennon did when Ringo released his 1973 album, his self-titled album, Ringo. And there's a song on that album titled I'm the Greatest.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the Greatest follows the same format as With a Little Help from My Friends, where John actually wrote the song, wrote the lyrics, and the song is talking about Billy Shears.
Okay.
And Ringo sings it, but they're not talking about Ringo. They're referring back to the person that replaced Paul McCartney back in September of 1966. So, hope I didn't get too long-winded on you there.
No, that's amazing. I mean, I really want to learn about this because I have heard the Paul is Dead thing. I've heard people go back and forth, not diving too deep into it, but I do like looking. If it comes up, I'll look into it, like a few documentaries and that. I find it interesting. on both sides, and I'm very open to all of this. I mean, I don't know a lot about the Beatles. I don't make any columns about it. I just don't. It's not somebody I focused on a lot. I'm like I said, it's changing. My taste, it's growing on me, and that happened with the Doors. I remember first hearing the Doors. I did not like them. I could not stand them. I was like, get the music off. I don't understand this music. And then like 4 years later, I played the Doors, and then I loved them. And then I dove in, got all their vinyl, and so I think you have to be ready for it. So that's just the way my music taste goes, and it's changing even to this day. But I'm like, when a lot of people, I think, they see the Beatles come over and they break. I think on the Ed Sullivan Show. What show is it that people remember?
Yeah, it was the Ed Sullivan Show back in '64.
Right, but I like the way you go back to the beginning. That's where I want to start. People have this image of the Beatles, like we're saying on the Ed Sullivan Show, but I found their history before that really fascinating. I wonder if a lot of people don't even know about it.
I should also mention that my research goes way beyond Paul McCartney being swapped out and replaced.
It sure does, yeah.
So for me, the replacement of Paul McCartney became a subplot, that there's a much larger play at hand. And it has to do with the Beatles as a massive psychological operation to social engineer the world, and being a creation of the Tavistock Institute out of Britain. And the Tavistock Institute reports up through the Committee of 300. And there's a couple of books, if you don't mind me, Rick, taking a moment here to get people acclimated. So the world, the way it's presented to the masses as to how it works with presidents and prime ministers and parliaments and the Congress, if we're talking about the United States, that's all theatrics. That's all puppet theater in front of the curtain. If you really want to know how the world works, I would say start with this book here. This is by Dr. John Coleman. The book was released in the early 1990s. It's the Committee of 300.
Okay.
And in this book, Coleman talks a bit about the Beatles being a creation of Tavistock, because Tavistock reports into the Committee of 300. The Committee of 300 refer to themselves as the Olympians, the gods.
Oh, wow.
Okay? So that's book number one. So once you get through that book and you understand about the Committee of 300, then I recommend these two books to learn about Tavistock. Tavistock is very, very important. And it's very important to understand who they are and how they go about their business. They are fundamental to all of the deception, the social engineering, the mass manipulation, the brainwashing and the mind control that takes place across the world. And this is another topic where a lot of people have a difficult time trying to understand how it is an organization like Tavistock has that much power. And we could talk about it as we progress through the show, and I'll explain it the best I can. But the best way to understand it is not listening to me on this show, because I can only cover it from a high-level perspective because of time. Here's a book by Daniel Estulin. It's called Tavistock, Social Engineering the Masses. So I recommend this book. This is a very good primer. Then what we want to do is, let me see if I have it here. Hopefully I do. Okay, well, there's another book by Dr. John Coleman, and it's his book on Tavistock. I don't have it here in front of me, but that book is absolutely fabulous. So read Daniel's book first, and then jump to Dr. John Coleman's book on Tavistock.
Okay.
And you'll have a very quick grasp on why it is that they are very, very important to what goes on in the world and how the world operates. Behind all this is an ideology, a spiritual ideology that goes back to this guy, Aleister Crowley.
Who we're going to dive into. Crazy. Yep.
So a very good book to understand Crowley as far as his connections into British intelligence going back to World War I is a book by Richard Spence titled Secret Agent 666.
I have to get that book.
It's a very good book. Another book on Crowley that I'm about a third of the way through right now, and it's also a very good book, is this one here. It's Aleister Crowley and the Cult of Pan.
Okay, I got to write that down. Okay.
That's another very good book. So that's just some of my recommendations before we get started, because people will ask about Crowley, they will ask about Tavistock, they will ask about the Committee of 300, and like I said, I can only cover so much in an interview.
I agree.
And to really understand, folks, you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and dig in. You're going to have to read books. You're going to have to do research and connect the dots.
Yeah. And that's what happened to me, Mike, is that I've heard it over the years. I've heard of Tavistock, and, I think a lot of listeners have they got kind of an idea of what they are. But it was somebody that emailed me and said, you got to really dig into Tavistock. You can't just watch a 1 hour documentary and think you got the picture, which was the mistake I did at first. And then when I started reading more and diving into it, it really, to me, it's a picture. It's part of the puzzle. I was saying to you when we did our little pre-interview on Saturday, I said, I think that's a major piece of the picture people are missing is the Tavistock and just how powerful they are. I keep trying to tell people on the show what we're up against,
right? And
that they're into everything. I said, and then some people say, oh, so everything in life is a lie. I'm like, well, it's definitely being manipulated. It's being twisted, and they're into everything. Pick the thing, schooling, medicine, government, anything. They're in there, and they're steering people. And so people have to, like you said, read and really dive into Tavistock and the Committee of 300. It's key to figuring out what's going on in our world today.
Yeah, and once you do that, when you used to ask the question, you mean everything is a lie? You'll start to understand that, yes, just about everything is a lie.
Agreed.
I know it's not something people want to hear, but if you don't want to hear it and you want to deny it, then what's going to happen is it's going to be status quo. Things are going to continue to go the way they're going, and they're not going in a good direction. But if you educate yourself on how the control system works, how the deep state works, how it really works, not this nonsense that they talk about on Fox News and MSNBC and stuff like that, then we increase the odds that we're going to be able to turn the ship around. Because if you don't understand your enemy, if you don't understand their tactics, if you don't understand how they operate, then how are you going to defeat them?
I agree with everything you're saying. So I'm nodding here.
Yeah. So the Beatles are a creation of Tavistock. This came out as a clue, actually, in the memoirs of Billy Shears that I picked up going back a number of years ago with regard to their music. The Beatles not writing all of their own music and not being on all of their recorded tracks. So now what happens, Rick, is with a lot of researchers that do the whole Paul is dead bit, they primarily focus on the replacement of Paul McCartney. So they will major on, well, here's biological Paul McCartney, and here's the guy that replaced him. And some will refer to him as Fall. I call him Billy because he refers to himself as Billy Shears. In the book, he gives us an alias. He says his name is William Shepherd. What does a shepherd do? A shepherd leads flocks. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to the cult of Pan. And we could talk about that a little bit. It does get a bit esoteric. There's a lot of ties back to mythology. Mm-hmm. But this is how the controllers roll. Yep. This is how they do things. So what happened was, when I first got into the whole Paul is dead research, I initially started with looking at the replacement of Paul McCartney. But then what happened was, I thought to myself, things just didn't happen, let's say, in September of 1966. So the story would say that Paul was killed in a car crash, and so then there was a mad rush to go find somebody who can replace him, somebody that looked like him, that plays like him, sings like him, that whole bit there. That's just a story, because there was no last-minute 11th hour rush to go find a replacement. Because what if you couldn't find a replacement? What were you going to do? And then the other thing was, why did they keep it a secret? The standard issue story says, well, the reason why they kept it a secret was because they didn't want to upset the fans, and they were concerned that some fans might hurt themselves or commit suicide because they were so in love with the Beatles and Paul McCartney. I'm not kidding you. Wow. This is some of the narrative that is around why they didn't, when I say they, I'm talking about the controllers, I'm talking about Tavistock, why they didn't announce that Paul McCartney died and they were going to replace him with somebody else in the band. It's a nonsense story, in my opinion. So what we have to do is we have to go back in time, and that's what I did. And this is where I catch a lot of flack by other people in the Paul is dead community and other researchers, because they don't want to touch the piece before he was swapped out, because many of them want to hold on to that story. I call it the Cinderella story, that the Beatles were organic, they evolved naturally, they were prolific genius songwriters. They want to hold on to that bit.
I ran into that. I told you that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mike, but I ran into that. And I was telling you that before we went live. I said, boy, I talked to somebody that really loves the Beatles, and I said, I told them that we were going to be talking about this, and they got upset that I even brought it up, that they weren't these great genius musicians at the beginning. And I was like, whoa, like, so I see where I can imagine when the heat you've gotten.
What Tavistock majors in, Rick, is creating cults. And their ability to create cults allows them and the controlling system to be able to manage the masses. If you believe something so stridently that you're not going to budge, that actually makes it easier for that person to be manipulated, because you know exactly how they're going to react to certain questions or situations or circumstances. So on top of creating cults, what they do is Tavistock looks to reduce the adult behavioral patterns, the critical thinking, down to that of a child. And you see this a lot, not just with the Beatles, but with other bands, where there is a romanticism that takes place with these bands. People are in love with their bands, they're in love with their artists, they're in love with their celebrities and their entertainers, their sports figures, their politicians, the Silicon Valley, quote, icons. Elon Musk as an example. People just fawn over these entertainers. And whenever you do that, when people do that, what they don't realize is what they're doing is they are worshiping. It's idol worship. Then there's a tendency to follow. Even if it's subconscious, they follow. So in the arena of the Beatles, you have this gigantic fan base, with many of them being very fanatical. And they will follow the band to the ends of the earth, even though the band is no longer in existence. And I'll explain more as to why that's so fitting, because I refer to the Beatles as the Pied Pipers of Aleister Crowley's Aeon of Horus. And when people worship and they idolize, what they do is they are going outside themselves. They're disempowering themselves, and they're giving up a level of their authority, because now they're ripe to be told what to do, how to do it, when to do it. We saw this with the March 2020 event. You know, back then, I thought that a lot more people were awake than there actually were.
I did too. Yep.
I called it a complete hoax way back in March of 2020, and I just did not believe it was going to get legs, and then I was just shocked.
Me too.
How many people rolled up their sleeves, fell in line, and the rest is history.
That's what got me into what I'm doing, was how quickly I saw people roll over. And I've said it on this show. Any of my listeners know that I get going on this sometimes, because I'm like, how quickly, like, people forget is the thing that really gets to me too. Like, you know, we don't, you know, now you move, and I know they engineer it this way. They keep the next fear bullet in the chamber, boom, and they just keep repeating,
right,
and it's the next fear. But I tell people, they shut the world down. Like, this is not this is the power of that. And I think they were putting a shot across the bow to see if they could get away with it. And I think even they were shocked. I really believe that. I think they were like, oh my God, they're actually going along with this. It's like, I can't believe it worked.
Yeah, I just didn't think. I had to reset my barometer as to how many people were really awake.
Agreed.
And guess who was behind all of that, as far as the manipulation and the mind control and the brainwashing and the selling of the whole story? It was Tavistock. The controlling system is an international system. It knows no borders. It does not recognize national sovereignty. We have to understand that. All of the intelligence agencies across the world, especially what we refer to as the West, they all work together. So even though we'll talk about the CIA, and we'll talk about the British MI6, and we'll talk about the Israeli Mossad, even though they're separate entities on paper, they are, for all intents and purposes, one, because they're all operating and working toward the same goals, the same agenda, which is a one world government with a one world religion. And the reason why I'm giving everybody this backdrop is because the Beatles played a very important role in getting that ball rolling. We'll go back in time. A lot of folks, a lot of Beatle fans, they think they know the beginnings of the Beatles, and that's because, they may have watched documentaries or they may have read books. These documentaries and most of these books are feeding you what I refer to as a Cinderella story. It's the official narrative. It's a fictional account of the Beatles' backstory. Now, are there threads of truth in it? Yes, there are threads of truth because every lie, every deception has to have some truth.
A thread of it, yep.
Making its way through it, right, in order to keep it together and make it appear feasible. So, the Beatles wind up in Hamburg, Germany in August of 1960. Before that, they were known as the Quarrymen, and they were doing some gigs at the Casbah Club, which was in the house of Pete Best and his mother, Mona Best. But in August of 1960, they have a manager, and his name is Alan Williams. And Alan Williams, no relation to me, I refer to Alan as their first handler. So he takes them to Hamburg. Now, the other thing we should understand is Hamburg and Frankfurt in Germany are hotbeds for Tavistock. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to understand. Why Hamburg? And when the Beatles get to Hamburg, they are there from August 1960 to December of 1960, and it's a total failure. They get booked in these clubs. They're not very good. In fact, the way I describe it is, and I'm probably being very generous, they were mediocre at best as far as musicianship goes, and they showed absolutely no acumen for songwriting. So they weren't songwriters, and they weren't very good musicians. So we have to understand this. So they leave in December of 1960. They come home dejected. Nothing materialized. Nothing happened. It wasn't a good time. They were living in squalor while they were there. For a moment, let's just pause there. There are images on the internet of the Beatles with occult symbolism, engaging in occult symbolism, surrounded by occult symbolism. And one of those images are images of Paul McCartney and George Harrison with bird cages on their heads. And there's also an image of John Lennon in a Superman shirt with his head next to a bird cage. Now, birdcage symbolism in Illuminati speak is a reference to mind control, being a mind control slave. So we have to keep that in mind. So the whole birdcage thing, for me, raised a red flag. This tells me that it's very possible that the Beatles were in a mind control program from an early age. Now, how early? I don't know. But by having that symbolism out there, that's communicating out that there's a mind control program involved. That's where I landed with it.
Agreed. Yep.
Now, it gets even more interesting because when we take a look at the image of John Lennon with his head next to the birdcage, he's got a Superman shirt on. That's also now telling us about John Lennon being tied into a mind control program, but the Superman shirt is in reference to the Übermensch, the superhuman. And this is a philosophy and an ideology of the controllers. It's a philosophy and ideology of Aleister Crowley, of Nietzsche. So we've all heard Yuval Harari saying that they have gotten to the point now where they have evolved, or they're in a position of being godlike. They are gods now. So I hope most people have heard that nut job talk about this.
Yeah, I hope so.
So when we talk about the Übermensch, the superhuman, that is a reference to becoming godlike. And this is really one of the main tenets behind Crowley and his religion of Thelema, which I have deducted is the primary belief system, spiritual and philosophical belief system of the controllers. So if we think of the controllers as it being a pyramid, I call it the pyramid of power. I believe many of them, the majority of them, subscribe to Crowleyism, and it is a form of Luciferianism.
I totally agree. And it's really funny that I've talked to this about people, like I try to talk to people in person, Mike, and I talk to them about this, even online though I will. And some people snap right back and go, well, I don't believe in that. And I always tell them, I'm like, you may not believe in it, but they do. Like that is their religion. Like they believe it. And I'm like, it doesn't matter if you believe in it. That's not the point.
People tell me that too. I don't believe in that stuff, and I don't believe this, and I don't
Hmm.
believe that. I don't believe in the power of numbers and all that. And I say, well, it doesn't matter what you believe because you don't run anything.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be flip, but it's the truth. So the people who are in power, they have a belief system. They have an ideology. And their spiritual, for lack of a better term, belief system goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. And it goes back to Babylon, and as well as Greek mythology and other mysteries. But with Crowley specifically, he's clearly centered in the Egyptian mysteries
For sure.
and the Egyptian mythology of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus. So when Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum announced the Great Reset, it's the return of Set. And what does that mean? What they're looking to do when they say the return of Set, it's the return of chaos, it's the return of darkness. And now what's going to happen in their minds, okay, because this is the Egyptian mythology, there's going to be a battle between Set and the savior god, Horus. And this ties back to the Beatles. If we take a look at Peter Jackson's documentary that he did on Let It Be, the Get Back documentary going back a couple of years ago,
Yep. Yep.
if you take a look at the splash screen that Peter's team put together, it says Get Back, but take a look at the way the G is written, the font. It looks like an S. Set back, or Set is back. What they're doing is they're going through an alchemical process. This is what they're doing. And the elites, the controllers, whatever you want to call them, the Illuminati, they are driven by their belief system. It's another ism. The people behind the curtain are running the world based upon their spiritual and philosophical beliefs.
Hmm.
All right, so the reason why I wanted just to cover that a little bit. So now let's go back to the Beatles in the early days. So we've got the Beatles. Now they're young guys. In August of 1960, I think George is like 17 years old. Paul is 18 years old. John's a little older. Pete Best is there. There's no Ringo at this point in time. And so, they go through this 1960 period, August through December, and nothing materializes. John and Paul come back to Liverpool, dejected. And so then what happens is, they get into 1961, and they're doing these gigs. They're playing in Liverpool and in adjacent areas, and they're still not a very good band. They meet up with Brian Epstein on November 9th of 1961. So here we have another 11/9 or 9/11 encoded date or event.
Yeah.
From that point on, let's just take November of 1961, move forward now 2 months. They wind up with a demo with Decca Records on January 1st of 1962. I need the audience just to stop and think about this, and especially if you are a musician and a songwriter and you're in a band. I want you to think through this. They show up in August of 1960 in Hamburg. They're not very good musicians. They're not songwriters. Then, 16 months later, they wind up at Decca doing an audition.
That doesn't make sense. Like, okay.
15 songs, 12 of which are covers, and then they did 3 originals, nondescript originals, which never made their way. The originals never made their way onto any of their albums when they were together as a band, as a unit. The songs didn't make it onto an album until later on when Anthology was released in the 1990s. So they do this tape, this demo with Decca, and Decca turns them down. Decca says, no, we're not going to sign you. A month later, in February, their manager, Brian Epstein, they have a new manager now.
Hmm.
It's no longer Alan Williams. He takes tapes to George Martin, and George Martin worked for EMI. And George Martin was the head of the Parlophone label. So Parlophone was part of EMI. And so Brian Epstein plays the tapes for George Martin, and George Martin, I'll read you exactly what he said. He says to Brian Epstein, if you want me to judge them based on what you are playing me, I'm sorry, I need to turn you down. So what's interesting is now they've been turned down twice, by Decca and by EMI. Then mysteriously what happens is they are then doing performances for the BBC. Now we have to take a step back and say, okay, now hold on a second. You weren't a very good band. You weren't writing songs. 16 months later, you wind up at Decca doing a demo. Okay, they turned you down. Then you go to EMI. You play tapes for George Martin. Martin turns you down. And then somehow you wind up connected into the BBC and you're doing the live at the BBC sessions. Well, how did that happen?
Yeah, that doesn't. Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing we should know about the live at the BBC sessions, they were not live. So for those of you that have the CDs and you think you're listening to live performances, you are not. It's documented in mainstream sources that those sessions, they did takes and they did overdubs. And then the shows were released a couple of weeks down the line.
Oh, okay.
I don't even believe the Beatles were playing on those BBC sessions that we're hearing on the CDs. Session players with the Beatles doing the vocals, but we can get into that in a little bit. So then what happens is, so now the Beatles are starting their BBC gigs, and that runs through, I think it was mid-1965. And while they're doing that, they're also continuing to play night after night after night after night. If it wasn't in Hamburg for weeks on end, they were doing local gigs around Liverpool and the adjacent areas. So they were getting all of these gigs. So another question is, how were they getting all of these gigs? And if you take a look into Wikipedia and you type in the Beatles live shows, you're going to see that it was just about every night. They had a couple of breaks here and there, but it was just bam, 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 bam. It just kept going. So they're doing that. They're doing the BBC gigs. Now, this is a band that was turned down twice by Decca and EMI.
Yeah.
So then in June of 1962, they are signed by EMI. George Martin had a change of heart. So 4 months prior, George said no. And then 4 months later, he's like, okay. Now, in the book, it tells us that George Martin was instructed to reverse his decision and sign the band. Now, the question becomes, who made the phone call to George to tell him wrong answer? I'll give you a little bit of backstory. George reported to a guy by the name of Len Wood. And Len Wood and George Martin, ultimately reported up to the chairman of EMI, Sir Joseph Lockwood. Now, when I did the research on this, I wanted to understand, why was George Martin's decision reversed? George Martin wasn't just a producer, folks. He was the head of the Parlophone label. He was promoted to head the Parlophone label in 1955 when Oscar Prius resigned. Now, some people are under the belief, because this is what the official narrative tells us, that George Martin he was doing classical records and he was doing comedy records like with Peter Sellers and the Goons and stuff like that. And he didn't know anything about rock and roll and yada, 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 yada. That's not true. When George Martin took over the Parlophone label, he was looking to bring in current acts, which means rock and roll. He was looking to bring rock and roll to the label.
Yeah.
Because he's heading up the label, right? He doesn't want the label to die on the vine with comedy records and classical music. So that whole bit where people are told that he didn't know anything about rock and roll and the Beatles taught him rock and roll, that's not true, based upon my research.
Okay.
George was way ahead of the curve, looking for acts to bring in so that he could pump up the label and have an inventory of artists. Now, what happened in 1962 is the Beatles recorded 2 songs, Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. And his immediate boss, George Martin, his immediate boss was Len Wood. There was some tension between the two of them. And Len told George to sign the band, and I'll give you my opinion on this. I believe Len Wood had the bigger picture understood as far as where the Beatles were going. So he told George Martin, look, sign them. And Len Wood was looking to flow the publishing rights, at the very least for the first 2 songs, which were recorded in 1962, Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, to EMI's publishing arm. Because there's going to be a lot of money if you own the publishing rights to the Beatles' music. So even though they were starting with the first 2 songs, I believe it's possible Len knew what was coming. He was in on the overall strategy of where the band was going to be taken. George Martin signs it, but then George Martin does not lead the Beatles publishing to EMI. I want to say this carefully because I don't want to make it sound like George Martin was behind this, but he was having discussions with Brian Epstein about forming a different publishing company, like a standalone publishing company, which became Northern Songs. And Northern Songs came in under the umbrella of Dick James Music, which was a huge publisher back in the day. Now, why did George Martin do this, right? So George Martin was having issues with EMI because he didn't feel he was being compensated properly. He had compensation concerns, and he would voice them periodically with Len Wood. So again, this is conjecture on my part, folks. I'm speculating because I haven't found anything that spells out exactly why it is there was this change in decision from not signing them to signing them. So I think what happened was there was a little tit for tat going back and forth between Len Wood and George Martin. So George said, okay, fine, we'll sign him. But the publishing didn't go to EMI. And by the way, between Dick James and Brian Epstein, they took a huge piece of the publishing at that point. So that's a little bit of a backdrop. So George is told, you got to take them on. George, he signs them. But here's the other kicker. When the Beatles show up, George Martin doesn't work with them immediately. He assigns it to his assistant, Ron Richards. So George is still not touching the band. In Memoirs, it tells us that Ron Richards spends time with the Beatles in the studio, and he really couldn't get anything out of them. They were not studio savvy. They just weren't very good musicians. So they listened to the playback, and it was at that point, again, this is spelled out in Memoirs, George Martin gets another phone call and says, okay, look, there's no delegation on this. You have got to work with this band directly. Now, Ron Richards, so everybody knows, Ron later went on to produce the Hollies. So Ron was, he wasn't a slacker. Ron was very capable. But, George Martin was told, okay, you need to work with them directly. So what I want to do now is, so we're up to June of 1962. And what I want to do is just read you some quotes from George Martin.
Okay.
Now, before I do that, there was a Mersey Beat article going back to August, September of 1962. In that article, it announced that Pete Best was out, Ringo was in as the drummer. But in that article, it also says this, and I'll read directly from the article. The Beatles will fly to London to make recordings at EMI Studios. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for the group, which they have received from the recording manager, George Martin.
That's interesting.
So let me read that again, folks. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for them. Not by them, for them. So George Martin is looking for music that they can record. Why is that? In the 1980s documentary, The Complete Beatles, it tells us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney, between the two of them, whether individually or as a team, between 1956 and 1962, wrote 100 songs between them. They didn't record them, but they wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. Yet, when they get signed by EMI, apparently they didn't have any songs to bring to George Martin, or if they had songs, George Martin deemed them as not good enough.
Not good enough, yeah.
To be recorded, right? So Here are some other things that George said. On meeting the Beatles in 1962, he said, I wasn't terribly impressed with the first stuff they did. In a documentary that is titled Produced by George Martin, there is a scene where George Martin is speaking to Howard Goodall. Howard Goodall is a composer and a broadcaster. He's a very accomplished composer. And George says to Howard, they had this wonderful charisma. They made you feel good, but I thought their music was rubbish. And then in another interview, he says that even though they had really nothing behind them, now remember, George is saying they had nothing behind them, but the documentary says that they had 100 songs written between them between 56 and 62. And George Martin is saying they had nothing behind them, but they were still fairly irreverent. And then he goes on to say, so I looked at these four guys and I thought none of them shines above all the others. So nobody stood out. He said, Love Me Do was the best song I could find from them at the time. I was very conscious. It was not the big hit I was looking for. And then in another interview, he says that They certainly had no, and then he pauses for a second because he's measuring his words. He says, it wasn't too obvious. They can be songwriters at this stage. Love Me Do was the best thing they had. So this is coming out of the mouth of George Martin.
Right, right.
So back in the day, between their first UK release, Please Please Me, and Rubber Soul, their sound engineer was a gentleman by the name of Norman Smith. So in 1971, in a music magazine called the New Musical Express, in the article, Norman Smith says the following things. He was not impressed at all. They were awful. He had doubts about their musical ability. With regard to recording Love Me Do, he said we had some hard times working on that one. And he said in the article that they failed in the studio. Now, in that article, what he then does, which is something that we see a lot in the Beatle narrative, you'll have these unflattering things said, and then they move to kind of like they want to prop up the story.
Okay.
So they move to a more flattering line of discussion, and then Norman goes on to say that the Beatles talked their way into a contract. Now, between you and me, Rick, nobody talks their way into a contract.
Nope.
Right?
Exactly.
Either you have it or you don't.
Yep.
Then he goes on to say they had so much personality and so much magic about them. And the word magic is very important. If we get an opportunity to talk more about Crowley, we'll understand why. When you look at the Beatles narrative and you really investigate and dig into the official narrative, the official story, some of the stuff is just, it borders on ludicrous. So as an example, we're told that for the Beatles' first album, UK release, their official releases, by the way, were their UK albums, not the Capitol releases in the US. They tell us that in February of 1963, the Beatles recorded 10 of the 14 songs in their first album in one day, in one long session.
Wow. Okay.
10 of the 14 songs were recorded in one day. But here's the kicker. Norman Smith goes on to say that we did their first album, Please Please Me, in one take. In one take. I'm going to tell you right now, I have been a musician for a long time, a songwriter for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very familiar with the recording process, very familiar with writing songs, the music, the lyrics, and so on. 10 songs, bang, 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 bang in one take.
That doesn't even sound plausible.
Right?
Yeah.
So then he goes on to say we did the whole album in a day. That's how we did it back then. But we have to remember now, I just read you this piece, folks, right? But if we go back to what he also said in the article, he was not impressed with them. They were awful. They had a hard time getting Love Me Do down, and they failed in the studio. So this is what we're talking about. This is what I refer to as the unofficial story around the Beatles. So we have this whole backdrop here, and then what happens is in March of 1963, they released their first album, Please Please Me. So remember now, they get signed in June of 1962, and then a mere 9 months later, from a band that had nothing behind them, that their producer felt like he needed to go find songs for them,
they make an album.
They make an album.
Wow.
So this band that had nothing behind them, now they have these 8 original songs in the bag on the first album, Please Please Me. And by the way, it was released on March 22nd of 1963. March 22nd is 322. It's the Skull and Bones number. Fast forward, then we get to their second album, With the Beatles. That's released in November. So 8 months after Please Please Me is released, in November of 1963, and it was on November 22nd of 1963, which is the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And November 22nd is 11 and 22, which is 33.
Another occult number.
Another occult number, okay? On that album, another 8 original songs and 6 covers. So between the first 2 albums, we have a band that didn't have any songs. They weren't very good musicians. And now all of a sudden, there are 16 songs that we're told that they wrote, originals, for the first 2 albums. And then when we move forward to the third album, A Hard Day's Night, There's 13 tracks on A Hard Day's Night, and we're told that all 13 tracks were penned by the Beatles. No covers. Once you dig into it, there should be a lot of questions.
For sure. Right.
So now, just to give you some time frames, just to put it into perspective, okay? And let me see here. Let me just get there. Okay. So let's just use Hamburg as a stake in the ground. August of 1960. So here is some elapsed time analysis. From Hamburg to the Decca audition, 1 year and 4 months, 20 days, 16 months. Remember, they started as nothing. Hamburg to the EMI contract in June of 1962, 1 year and 10 months. Hamburg to their first release, Please Please Me, their first UK album, 2 years and 7 months. Hamburg to With the Beatles, 3 years and 3 months. Here's something I think people really need to get their heads wrapped around. Starting with the starting point being August of 1960 in Hamburg, and then landing in the United States on February 7th of 1964 is 3 years and 5 months. So the Beatles went from zero to hero in 3.5 years. From Hamburg to landing in America. And by the way, when they came to America, the tagline for that was, the Beatles conquer America.
Yep.
The British invasion. So when we talk about the British invasion, think in terms of Tavistock. The Tavistock invasion. The Beatles conquer America. It was very important for the world order, the New World Order, for the deep state, however you want to refer to them, whatever label you want to give them, the control system, to be able to take control of the United States and to take down traditional values, and especially they had institutionalized religion on the radar too, and specifically Christianity.
Right.
So Christianity was in the crosshairs. Christianity had to be taken down along with the traditional values that permeated the United States. So the Beatles were all part of that, and a lot of people struggle with that because they say, well, I don't know. I mean, I like the Beatles' music, and they were these 4 mop-top lads. I mean, well, what you have to understand is the way Tavistock operates is it's incremental and it's methodical. So they had to start very basic. Now, understand also that when the Beatles were in Hamburg, they weren't in suit and ties. They were dressed in leather.
That's interesting, too. Yeah.
Yeah. So when Brian Epstein got them, he cleaned them up. Like he threw them in the shower, scrubbed them up, said, here, right? Here, wear, here's a white shirt, a tie, here's some Beatle boots, and here's a suit, and this is how we're going to move forward until we got to later towards 65, 66, especially when we get to 1967 with the release of Sgt. Pepper. That's when everything changed drastically. But there were still changes between 62 and 66. The Beatles released 2 albums a year from 1963 through 1966.
Jeez. So
they were on the hook for 2 a year, in the early part of the year, and then another album later in the year in time for Christmas. So in 63, it was Please Please Me and With the Beatles. In 64, it was A Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale. In 1965, it was Help, and it was Rubber Soul. And then in 1966, it was Revolver. And then they released a, quote, greatest hits album. And I don't know if we're going to be able to get into this too much, but it was really a transitional album. It was called A Collection of Oldies.
Okay.
So here we had a situation where in the latter part of 1966, they released an album called A Collection of Oldies for songs that only dated back 3 years. Why would you refer to a song that was recorded 3 years ago or 2 years ago or a year ago as an oldie?
Doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Well, the reason for that is because Paul McCartney was gone at the end of Revolver. So Revolver was released on August 5th of 1966. He passed away on September 11th of 1966. And so they had to put a second album out. So what they did was they put this transitional album out, A Collection of Oldies, which was a, quote, greatest hits album. And that was the segue, the bridge between Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. And Sgt. Pepper was Billy's album. That was Billy and George Martin working together.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Billy, when I talk about Billy, folks, I'm talking about the guy that's playing Paul McCartney today. He's the guy that's had the primary contract to play Paul McCartney since 1966, to current day. So when we think in terms of Paul McCartney, the actual biological Paul was there from 62 to 66. If we just separate out the Hamburg days, I'm talking about when the Beatles were popular,
Right.
for 4 years. And then from 1966 to 2024, that's Billy. So that's why so many people have a hard time with this too, because the guy that they have been looking at for almost 60 years is the replacement.
Right.
Okay? By the way, Tavistock also was putting out images that included doubles and lookalikes. I was told by a source that from the very beginning, there were 3 doubles and or lookalikes for each Beatle right out of the gate. And doubles and lookalikes were used throughout the Beatles' timeline and also into their solo career. I have a clip. It's a dialogue between Mike Campbell and Benmont Tench from Tom Petty's band, the Heartbreakers. And it's just Mike and Benmont speaking, and they're talking about how Ringo sent a double to one of their recording sessions. And they were laughing. They said, this guy looks just like him. They were saying that when Ringo can't or doesn't want to do gigs or be at a certain event, he taps his double to go make the trip. Now, this is not me telling you that this happened. I have the clip on my YouTube channel, and you can listen to Mike Campbell and Benmont Tench of the Heartbreakers have a discussion about their experience with Ringo's double. And the book tells us Billy still uses a double to this day. That's some of the background that a lot of people don't know about.
That's fascinating.
The Beatles were not writing music in that early period. They were not writing music in Hamburg. Their Hamburg stints, they were playing like 7 hours a night. In an interview I have with Pete Best, going back many years ago, Pete said that when they were in Hamburg, they would show up at the venue, at the bar or the club at 6 p.m., and they would play for 7 hours a night. They would then head back to wherever they were sleeping, wherever they were hanging out. And in the very early days, back in the 1960s, they were in an old vacated cinema. That's where they were hanging their hat at night after the gigs. When I mentioned before, they were living in squalor. That's really what it was. It got better as they were being handled and groomed going through 61 into 1962, but they weren't writing music. So what Hamburg and their live gigs in Liverpool and areas adjacent to Liverpool, what that was all about was that was boot camp.
That makes sense.
That was to get the Beatles to learn to be better musicians, not great musicians. In fact, in a June 1966 interview at the Hilton in Japan, Paul McCartney is asked about their songwriting and their musicianship, and he says that we never claimed to be great musicians. We're adequate.
That's him saying that.
That's him saying that. Now, what we have to keep in mind is in August of 1966, in June of 1966, I should say. There's another interview in August of 1966 I'll talk about in a minute. In June of 1966, they were just wrapping up the recording of Revolver, which is considered a seminal record, along with Rubber Soul and even Help. And for one of the main songwriters, Paul McCartney, to say that they were adequate, I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't.
How could you have all of that under your belt? 7 albums at that moment in time. Please Please Me Through, Revolver. And then just say that, we aren't very good musicians. We never claimed to be, and we're adequate. It just doesn't resonate. It doesn't make sense. In an August 5th, 1966 interview, that was the day that Revolver was released. In that interview, he said that they were limited as a group. They were not very good musically. And he also made a comment. The Cinderella story tells us that the Beatles were writing music all the time. They were writing when they had their free time. They were writing when they were on tour. They were writing when they were filming movies. They were writing when they were in the recording studio. And in the August 5th, 1966 interview with the BBC, Paul McCartney states that the Beatles wrote in great big batches whenever they had to go in to do a record or a film. So he was saying that they were writing in great big batches. They were writing 12, 14, 16 songs in big batches. And during that interview, the BBC interviewer, He came across like he didn't even kind of believe that statement because he said, I always thought it was quite impossible to sit down and write 12 songs in a great big batch.
Yeah, from scratch. Wow. Try writing a song, people. Like I mean, I'm a musician now and I play with musicians, and try hashing out a song. Never mind that many. It's not easy. Like it's not.
But the most important thing, Rick, about what Paul said, and it's coming from the horse's mouth, is Paul took the official narrative, which says that they were writing all the time. They were writing when they were eating breakfast, when they were on the crapper. It didn't matter where they were always writing on the back of napkins and all of this stuff. And he said, that's not true. We wrote in great big batches. He took the official narrative and he just blew it out of the sky.
Yep, exactly.
But he presented another problem when he said that, because the problem he presented is, okay, so how is that done? How do you write 12, 14, 16 songs in a very, very short period of time? How do you do that?
That's a good question.
And that was never explained. In fact, when the BBC interviewer questioned the feasibility of writing 12 songs, just sitting down at a time, and said that it seems impossible, John said, well, it is at times quite impossible. So the point is that within the mainstream information that's out there about the Beatles, the truth is actually out there, but it's hidden in plain sight. It's what we see all the time with many, many conspiracies. You just have to read between the lines. You have to look under certain covers, under certain hoods, and you'll find information that you're really not supposed to know. But when you find it, if you're intrepid enough, you start to ask questions. So with me, what happened was I want to move to if you don't mind, Rick, to why I concluded that they did not write all their own music.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you. So yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so let me just take everybody through that. So what happened was I was reading memoirs. There was a passage it began on page 350 in one of the previous editions. I think the book has been updated 4 or 5 times. And the paragraph said that George Martin was going to take their little songs and make them great. So I thought to myself, well, they're supposed to be prolific genius songwriters. What is this bit about their little songs? And George Martin was going to make them great. And then the next page segues to the Committee of 300. And it mentions the snitch. The snitch was John Coleman. Coleman was a former intelligence officer with British intelligence, the British military. He turned whistleblower. And so in his Committee of 300 book, he talks about Tavistock creating the Beatles and the music being written for them. And the person that he mentions that wrote the music was Theodore Adorno. And Theodore Adorno was out of the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School is about 6 hours drive from Hamburg. And the Frankfurt School is connected at the hip to Tavistock.
Right. Yep.
So now, I don't agree with Coleman, Dr. Coleman, with all due respect, that Theodore Adorno wrote all of the music. I believe that Theodore Adorno was in an oversight capacity. He was overseeing this psychological operation, this social engineering project titled The Beatles. And he was working together with George Martin. The other thing also I should mention that EMI, the label EMI, has connections back to the British military industrial complex. So I believe it was Theodore Adorno and George Martin that were the managing directors. I think George was the managing director and Adorno was in an oversight capacity, reporting into the Frankfurt School in Tavistock to put this whole thing together. So, and I'll get into more of this in a moment, but what happened was, so I got the clues out of the book and I'm like, what is this book telling me? Mm-hmm. I think it's telling me that I should look into whether they wrote their music, all their own music. So sometimes, these synchronistic events take place in your life, Rick. And for me, I came across a series by Scott Fryman, and it's called Deconstructing the Beatles. And what Scott does, he's a musicologist, he's a composer himself. He has he's a very solid resume, but he presents the Beatles' official narrative. I'm not knocking Scott for that. That's what he does.
Okay.
On a lark, a little bird whispered in my ear and said, get the Rubber Soul series, the Rubber Soul episode of the series.
Okay.
of the deconstructing. So I call it deconstructing Rubber Soul. So I get the DVD, I buy it off of Amazon, and I get like 15, 20 minutes into it, Rick. And it's saying that the Beatles came in with essentially no backlog of music. They had to write 16 songs from scratch in the studio, 14 for the album, and 2 for a double A-side single. And they had to do this. They had to write both the music and lyrics. They had to learn the songs. So in other words, if John and Paul wrote a song, or if George wrote a song, they had to bring it to the other band members so that they can learn the song. Hey guys, this is how the song goes. What do you think? Then they had to rehearse the songs. And then once you introduce a song to the band, there's a give and take.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There's an ebb and flow about how this song should play out.
Absolutely. Yep.
Maybe the verse should change. Maybe we should add a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Hey, maybe we should extend the bridge. Maybe it doesn't need a bridge. How about the chorus sounds a little more like this? Let's add some keyboards.
I'm just smiling because with the people I jam with, you're so right. Like you bring it and this discussion goes on for hours. Like add this, pull this, try this.
So we're to believe that the Beatles wrote, learned, rehearsed, arranged, recorded, and mixed 16 brand new songs from scratch in 30 days. They came into the studio on October 11th of 1965 to record Rubber Soul. The recording started on the next day, October 12th, but they were in the studio on October 11th, according to Scott Fryman. And they finished up on November 11th into the wee hours of the night, actually in the early morning hours of November 12th.
Mm-hmm.
So on November 11th, we're told that they finished up recording 4 songs in one long session. 2 of those songs, we're told, didn't even exist prior to November 11th, the last day of recording. The 2 songs that were, allegedly written on November 11th and recorded on that day, not only just recorded, but written, learned, rehearsed, recorded, was You Won't See Me and Girl. They finished up I'm Looking Through You, which we're told that they started on November 6th. So 5 days later, on November 11th, they finish up I'm Looking Through You. And then we're told that to finish off the album with 7 songs on each side, a 14-track album, they brought us the song Wait in, the basic rhythm tracks, from the Help sessions earlier in the year. So they added some overdubs and vocals to that. Now, I'm going to say that doing that 4 songs, I don't even care if you brought one in from earlier in the year, if you still had to do overdubs and vocals, to get all of that done within 13 hours or whatever in a single day is not possible.
I'm with you on that one.
It's not possible. So, I had a couple of friends of mine. We did a show a number of months back. We discussed how the whole process works when you're putting a song together. One of the examples I use is, when I record, I might go through 4 or 5 guitars to get the right sound. I might check out a half a dozen amps to get the right amp sound. I might try different effects to make sure I get exactly what it is that I have in my head, because that's how it works. You have something in your head, and you want to take what's in your head and you want to be able to represent that audibly. And that's, that's really the basis of when you're songwriting and you're recording. Now, the other thing, too, what this says is that everything they touched, every song they started, they completed. That means not only the music, but the lyrics. It means they never stumbled, Rick.
Oh, okay.
It says they never had any false starts. So let me just take the folks through the calendar a little bit. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because we're getting really short on time here. But so they arrived at EMI. 1 day later, they wrote, rehearsed, recorded, and completed Run for Your Life. The second day in, they nailed Drive My Car, wrote the music, the lyrics, rehearsed it, had it in the bag 2 days after they arrived in the studio. They had Day Tripper nailed down on day 5. If I Needed Someone on day 7. Norwegian Wood on day 10. In My Life and Nowhere Man were both completed on the same day, 11 days in, on October 22nd. And we can work it out. 18 days in was in the bag on October 29th. And so I'm not going to go through November, but it's the same pattern in November.
Right.
So what we're seeing here is a conveyor belt. And writing music, lyrically and musically, is not a conveyor belt process.
Well, that makes a lot, like, that's what I hope people listening understand is it's one thing if you're a band and you're out in the circuit and you're developing, which most bands do. They tour, they do little bar gigs, they're honing their craft. That's why a lot of bands have an amazing first album. They have their whole life to craft it. And the point is they go into the studio and they have a lot of it hammered out. They're just doing, they do some fine tuning and stuff like that. But what you're talking about is going into a studio with nothing and writing it and doing what you're saying. That is a feat. That is astronomical.
A point I brought up a number of times in my presentations is I mentioned earlier that the Beatles were on the hook for 2 albums a year, right?
That's a lot of music. Wow.
So when we take a look at 1963, they had their 2 albums, Please Please Me with the Beatles, and the Beatles had a very, very hectic schedule. But they still had time to write 16 original songs for those first 2 albums. Then we get to 1964, and that's really when Beatlemania really kicked into high gear. So now the Beatles are doing worldwide tours in 1964. They did a movie, A Hard Day's Night, was sandwiched in between the recording period for the album of A Hard Day's Night. So not only were they in a period of time when they were recording the album, but they were also on a movie set filming a movie. And they were touring, and they were doing news conferences, and guess what? They came up with 13 original songs for A Hard Day's Night and 8 songs for Beatles for Sale. That's 21 original songs in that hectic period. And then as we get to 1965, Help is their first album in 65. Touring slows down a little bit beginning in 1965, but again, when they had the period of time when they were recording Help, they were also on the set to film the movie Help. And we're told that John Lennon wrote the song, I think it was Wait, on the movie set of Help. But I have an interview that was published in The Independent going back a number of years ago where John Lennon said that they were in a haze of marijuana the whole time that they were filming the movie Help.
I remember that. Yeah.
They were basically useless by the time they got to lunch. And the director of the film, Richard Lester, knew he had to try to get everything as much as he possibly could, as much filming as he possibly could into the earlier part of the day, because once they hit midday,
it was all she wrote.
They were so stoned, they were useless. But we're told that they wrote 12 songs for Help. It was a 14-track album, 12 were originals, and there were 2 covers. And then something happened, Rick. Everybody fell asleep. Everybody nodded off at the wheel because nobody was checking in with anybody about how they were coming along with songs for Rubber Soul.
Okay.
You see the point I'm making?
Yes.
So with all this busy schedule and everything that they were doing in 63, 64, and the beginning of 65, somehow they still found time to write music, we're told, allegedly.
Mm-hmm.
But then it goes dark. Brian Epstein, he didn't contact John Lennon and Paul McCartney or even George Harrison and say, hey guys, how are we doing with the songs? How many do you have? Because I have, and George Martin, we have studio time booked in October at EMI Studios, and we're going to need 16 songs.
Mm-hmm.
14 for the album,
Yep.
2 for a single. So I hope you guys are banging out tunes. Evidently, that conversation never took place. Nor, evidently, did it take place between George Martin and the band. The producer of the band, he doesn't inquire about how they're coming along
Right,
with songs.
I would be.
So
Yeah.
what happened was before they entered the studio on October 11th of 1965, 6 weeks before that, they were on their U.S. tour. The U.S. tour ends on August 31st, and then they have a 6-week break before they go into the studio. And some people want to claim that they wrote the 16 songs or whatever number of songs people want to say they wrote. Because some people want to argue and say, oh, they had some songs in the bag. I say, okay, look, you know what? I'm not going to argue this. Pick the number of songs, 10, 12, 14. That's still a ton of songs that you have to write from scratch and that you have to nail down within 30 days. I say 16 because I don't believe they came in with anything, and I'll explain why in a moment.
Okay.
So people want to say, oh, well, they were writing while they were on holiday between when the tour ended and when they had to show up at EMI on October 11th of 65. The problem with that is the official narrative tells us that's not what they were doing during their holiday. In fact, in one of Mark Lewison's books, I have two of his books, he clearly states that that period of time, that 6 weeks between when the tour ended and when they had to go into the studio to record Rubber Soul, the Beatles were on vacation. They were on holiday with no work. And if people want to argue that writing songs is not work, I'm going to tell you, try it. Yep. It's work, okay? Yep. Getting your band together, writing songs, rehearsing, going back and forth. And let me tell you, many times personalities clash. There could be arguments. That's the life of being in a band, folks. Mm-hmm. For those of you who have never been in a band, I'm telling you from experience, that's how it works. And you can get these stories from many, many other bands. In fact, many of the bands that you follow, there'll be stories like this where they were at each other. Look at the Kinks.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Right? They're a classic example. So what happened was I said, well, this makes no sense to me. Like I said, this is conveyor belt stuff. And so we go back to the August 5th, 66 interview, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney said that it's a bit of a drag for the first two songs. They're talking about writing music. They said the last LP, and I believe they were talking about Revolver because they did the interview when Revolver was released on August 5th. We took weeks just trying to get one song written. So if it took you weeks to get one song written for Revolver, mm-hmm. How did you write 16 songs in weeks? Because what's 30 days? 30 days is 4 weeks.
Yep.
And then in that same interview, Paul said we're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. The other thing with the Rubber Soul sessions is not one song took more than 5 takes to record the basic rhythm tracks.
Jeez.
Now remember, they came in with nothing, Rick.
Yeah.
Every song was 5 takes or less to nail the basic rhythm tracks. If we fast forward to the White Album sessions in 1968, I mean, you could take a look at Mark Lewison's books. Dozens of takes to get those songs done. 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. I think it was 100 takes to get the song Not Guilty recorded, which never made it onto a Beatle album. George released it as a solo song. So we're talking about dozens and dozens of takes 3 years later. So we have to ask the question, well, what happened to your studio prowess?
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah. In 65, you can do this stuff in less than 5 takes.
You're getting worse.
You're getting worse. Yeah. You're going backwards.
Yep.
Well, the truth of the matter is they weren't going backwards. It's the Rubber Soul story is total fiction. So the other thing with the 30 days is there were 6 days when there was no recording scheduled due to fan club obligations. That was 1 day. There was mixing within the 30 days. That was 2 days. They stepped out for a day to receive their MBEs. And they also stepped out for 2 days to do a TV special. So in October, they did 8 songs. They were recorded in 18 days in a total of 28 takes for all songs. So 8 songs in 18 days, no more than 28 takes for all 8 songs, which is an average of 3.5 takes per song. In November, they finished the other 8 songs. Remember, there were 16 songs, 14 for the album, 2 for the single, right? They did that in 13 days, in 5 less days than they did in October. In a total of 14 takes, which is 1.8 takes per song. And if somebody wants to argue, well, they brought weight in, so there were really no basic rhythm track takes, then we can say that the average was for November 2 takes per song. Mm-hmm. If I back weight out. Either way, it's not feasible. It's not reality.
It's not reality. No.
So 16 songs in 31 days with in a total of 42 takes for all of the songs, averaging 2.6 takes per song. 8 songs were started and completed on the same day, and 4 songs were completed on the very last day. I took everybody through that on November 11th, which is, in my view, an impossible task. So that's one problem with Rubber Soul, and there's another problem with the manufacturing process that I won't get into right now because we're really
I know I'm going to have to ask you, Mike. I hope you can come back and do a part 2.
Yes,
I would love to schedule that for in a few weeks if you're available. I know you're really busy, but I would love for you to, because we haven't even got into Tavistock and Aleister Crowley. We're just building this foundation. So I really hope we can do a part 2. I would love to have you back.
No, we'll definitely do a part 2, Rick. And I knew that we were going to have a lot of difficulty getting all of this in 2 hours. That's the thing with this. I've been at this for 8 years. There is so much. Yeah. I mean, I can talk about Tavistock and Aleister Crowley for 2 hours.
That's why I was going to go with part 2. Like, I'm glad we're building this foundation because, believe me, for all the listeners, this all ties in. What we're building here is very important to when we do part 2. So that's why I wanted to build this strong foundation, because then we can get into how they work. Like, I can see it, but people that haven't looked into what we know might not see what's happening, but I can see what's happening. So, and Tavistock and the Committee of 300 and is a very detrimental in what we're talking about. So this is important, this part.
But let me just, I'll give everybody the punchline, because I'm sure people are saying, well, Mike, like, well, how did it get done? Because the album it was released. Right. So how was it done? The way it was done, folks, is that all of the songs were pre-written by ghostwriters, songwriters, and they were recorded by session musicians. While the Beatles were out doing their tours, doing their films, and doing everything that they did publicly, behind the scenes, George Martin was pulling the music together. He pulled the studio musicians together. They recorded the instrumental tracks. And so the Beatles' job when they came in to the studio was to sing the vocals. So when Paul McCartney said that they wrote in great big batches, I believe what Paul McCartney was really saying was they had to learn the vocals in great big batches. So when the Beatles showed up at the studio on October 11th, George Martin already had the instrumental tracks recorded, and I'm sure there was a guide vocal so that they could listen to it, and then they could learn the vocals, they could learn the melodies, work on the harmonies. That's what they did for 30 days. That's what I concluded was the process for the Beatles from 1962 through 1966, and even going into the 67 to 70 period, although during the Billy period, 67 through 70, the Beatles, John Lennon and George Harrison in particular, were writing more of their own material and playing on more of the recorded tracks, but ghost writers and session players were still being utilized right through 1970.
That makes sense to me, yeah.
So that's the punchline. And by the way, if people think that that's a strange concept, I recommend a couple of, actually 3 documentaries you should watch. The Wrecking Crew. Watch The Wrecking Crew. That's how records got made. Pop records got made in the 1960s and the 1970s. And in England, they had their version of The Wrecking Crew with people like Vic Flick, Big Jim Sullivan. Also watched the documentary Hired Gun.
That was great. Yeah.
Yeah, Hired Gun picks up where The Wrecking Crew leaves off. So from the 1980s on, you'll see how these session players, they're the people that are on those tracks. In fact, if you watch Hired Gun, I have to watch it again, it tells us that on the Aerosmith albums, it wasn't Joe Perry on some of those tracks. And the last one, and because I know we're
we got like 30 seconds, so let's...
Muscle Shoals. Watch Muscle Shoals, and that is
amazing.
Another documentary. Wow. Must watch.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm already looking forward to part 2. I will set that up, guys. I will have Mike back, I promise. And we're going to dive into this even deeper, and it's going to be a must listen. Mike, where can they find all your work in that? I want you to have the last 30 seconds.
Okay, my hub website, Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY.com. It's all of my links are there.
Perfect.
All of my platforms, you can hit my music there, lots and lots of stuff there. So it's one-stop shop.
That's amazing. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. As I said, the listener made this happen by a request. Please reach out to me if there's guests you want. And I will have Mike back for part 2 as soon as I can set it up, guys. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for sticking around. And I will see you next Monday, guys. Have a great week. And thank you once again, Mike. Amazing.
Thank you, Rick.